and welcome to another illustration discussion video. Here I'm talking about my piece, Cybergoth on a Motorcycle. This is, the basic concept is a Cybergoth-styled woman in a cyberpunk environment. This particular building arcology complex that I've been developing over the last year or so for this story that I'm working on. She's seated on a motorcycle, interfaced with a bunch of computer equipment. This particular piece is being done pencils to ink, traditional pencils to traditional inks. That the inks will then be scanned at high resolution and then painted in Photoshop. So one of the inks to color pieces. My original composition is done with a 2H Staedtler pencil. It's done very light. You can see a little bit on the page in front of you right now, but really it's very difficult to pick up on camera, which is why I don't tend to include that portion in these particular videos. As to the tools that I'm using, the paper is 11-inch by 17-inch Strathmore Bristol 100-pound weight, smooth finish. It tends to be my preferred drawing surface if I'm not doing a gray paper or black paper illustration. The inking is being done for the most part with a Crowquill pen using Speedball Super Black ink. I will also be going back and forth on some of the later sections of the illustration with a Speedball lettering pen and a couple of different brushes. But most of the detail work, most of the, and certainly most of the initial layout will be done with this Crowquill pen now that I've finally cracked the proper technique for using Crowquills again. I'm extremely happy using them. I like the fact that it is a very, let me just pull one over here, actually. Don't know how well this will show up in this particular setting. I'll grab a couple of the pens that I use here. I like how, let's see, here we go, how fine that nib is. Oh, there we go. How tiny the nib is. The advantage of using something like this as opposed to a micron pen or a technical pen is that as you apply more pressure and twist the pen as you're using it, it will also vary the line width, giving you a lot of control, allowing for a lot of character in the line without going over it later. The Speedball pen, well, actually, use a couple of different Speedball lettering pens. This particular nib, there we go. It's still fairly narrow, but it is quite a bit wider than the Crowquill. And I was using this for some of the earlier ink illustrations in these illustration videos until I finally remembered how to use a Crowquill pen properly. It had been a very long time since I'd been doing a lot of traditional inking. Later on, I'll be doing some white ink inking, and I'll be using a different, this one I don't have to actually highlight, another Speedball lettering pen, slightly different shape, clearly being used for white ink from the amount of white ink that is covering the piece. For that I use Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay white ink. So when I put together the initial concept for the illustration, the initial layout, when I'm composing the entire image, I start with the main focus, whatever I consider the main focus of the piece to be. In this case, it is the woman sitting on a motorcycle, and then work outward from there. I will know where she is, what the setting is supposed to be, but I still want to build the setting around her. Once I have that layout done, however, and then I go in to do the actual inking or darker pencils, if I'm doing just a pencil illustration or a pencils to color piece, I then switch and do the background first. Then when I do the coloring, the same thing. This is consistent in all of these. It's pretty consistent in all these illustration discussion videos that I'm posting, where both the inking and the coloring work from back to front, whereas my initial composition is done from front to back. And one of the reasons I do this is when I'm putting in the inking and putting in the colors, I'm going to be making additional decisions as I go along. Like here, I've been putting in this very detailed, huge arcology style space with a variety of light sources all over the place, most of which would not reflect onto the main character because they're so far away. Like the interior of this space is approximately 10 stories tall. The buildings deep in the background would be at least 3 or 4 blocks away. So a lot of that light wouldn't actually affect her. But as I'm moving forward in space and continue inking moving forward in space, a lot of that light would end up falling onto the main character. And that'll change some of my lighting decisions when I actually get to start working on her. Whereas if I'd started just by inking her, I would have to make sure the background, any light sources that were ever pointed towards her had to be consistent. I couldn't suddenly get an idea to change it unless I wanted to then go back to the main character and rework some of my lighting decisions there. So this just makes things a little bit easier on me. It makes it as though it makes it appear that the main character or characters really are inhabiting the world that I've created here. That they're not just, a cardboard cutout illustration sitting on top of another illustration of a background. I really want them to be inhabiting the space I've created. Now, yes, that space was created for them, for the composition, but as you're working on a piece, you want to be able to let inspiration come to you. Be able to, if you get a good idea, you want to be able to flow with that, to make that work. So, if you're working on everything and you realize I may not have had that idea, for instance, of the raised platform way in the background there, that's traveling between two. That you could take between two different buildings in the background. And that platform may end up casting a shadow in the middle of a light source that I was going to be using on the main character. Now, in this case, that platform is too far away, so that wouldn't happen. But things like that, little moments like that you want to just be free to go ahead and include. You want to make sure that if you're including them, they're not detracting from the rest of the image. Plus, by working from the back to the front, I'm making certain that the central figure or the central figures, essentially whatever the story is about, everything in that background will serve to push focus towards that main character or characters. That I don't want to have anything in the background that'll overwhelm. It'd be attracting too much attention. And if I do create something in the background that works really well, that would really draw a lot of attention, I now have the option to be able to, as I'm continuing to work forward, possibly change the composition a little bit so that that character is actually reacting to that background image. Let's say I had put in front of the storefront right behind her, I had dropped in a lit up hologram that would be casting light everywhere and be very much attracting a lot of attention. And I could actually change, because I've only got her done in pencils at the moment, except for a little bit of outlining, just to make sure there's a barrier between her and the background line art. I still have the option to be able to turn her head slightly to react to that, or to then decide, maybe I should knock that background image back a little bit. Maybe whatever's sitting in the background should be, I could physically put something in front of it to minimize the effect it's having, if that's what I end up wanting to do. It's ultimately everything I'm doing in this illustration is serving to push focus towards the actual story. Whatever the story is in this image, it's about the central character. I don't always know what that story is. I've said this in many of these videos. In general, I'm setting up a situation where there is something happening. The main character is doing something. They're not generally just posing for the sake of a photo or a painting. They're actually involved in something. But I don't necessarily want to tell the viewer what that is. I don't always want to make it super obvious. I want the viewer to be able to bring their own ideas to it, to project, if you will, onto the main character a little bit, to see their story, the story of the character through their own eyes. So that gives me a lot more freedom. And frankly, it gives the viewer a lot more freedom to interpret things. The key things I need to worry about with this image is that it's taking place in this rundown giant arcology space. She has an overall Cybergoth look in the midst of the cyberpunk setting, seated on a motorcycle, but not operating the motorcycle. And the dreadfalls that she's wearing as part of that Cybergoth look are actually functioning as methods of communication with neural implants that she has. So they are actually interfaced with this communications tower behind her and all of this computer equipment to the side and in front of her. What all of that means, that's not up to me to figure out. If I was doing this in the middle of a story, if this was a large splash page, say, in the book that I'm working on, then certainly there would be a lot more dialogue going on. There would have been set up for what's actually happening here, or it would get further explained on subsequent pages. But in this particular setting, I get to leave all that vague. There is something, but what it is it's essentially a combination of the viewer's response to my original design. So the bulk of the background has now been inked. Trying to make sure that the background will separate on its own. I do have ideas about what I'm going to be doing with regard to color and particular special effects over some of that line art. But I also want all of these ink illustrations, even if I know I'm going to be coloring, to be able to function as a standalone illustration. Because all of these pieces just get put into a portfolio book, and I want anybody who looks through that portfolio book to know what the piece is. It won't be confusing because there are elements there that I haven't colored yet. The only confusion I would ever want in any of these images is where the viewer has to decide what the story is. But I want to make the elements of the story clear, who's in it, what they're interacting with, what the environment is. So all of those need to be able to separate well and not just become some abstract pattern. So one of the ways you can do that is, with regard to inking, is view inking roughly as 3 layers. In this case, it's probably closer to 2, but white, black, and gray. And anything that's in the foreground has to be one of those 3 layers. And anything that's in the middle ground has to be one of those layers. And anything that's in the background has to be one of those layers. What does that mean? Well, when you're dealing with black and white, why would I be talking about white, black, and gray. I'm not putting in any gray ink or anything. Essentially, if you are working on, let's say you're working on a deep background that has a lot of heavy black areas, a lot of areas in that deep background are in deep, deep shadow. There's so much black ink in the background area that it effectively becomes a black layer. There's very, very little light in there. The middle ground could be something like a bunch of buildings with a lot of detail that essentially, if you were to squint your eyes, it would turn a little gray. All that detail would kind of blend into each other. That would be the gray layer. And then in the foreground, you have a couple of characters talking, and you've basically just outlined them, put some detail onto their outfits, put some detail into their skin texture, into their hair, and whatever items are in the immediate environment on that same plane. But the dominant color is white. It's mostly white space. That's your white layer. So now when somebody looks at the image, they'll just intuitively get that the heavy black is deep in the background. The gray area is this middle ground, and the large areas of white are the foreground. Now, you don't have to have it set up that way. In fact, in this particular image, the foreground it's actually a mix of heavy blacks and open white sections. When I get, we can already see on the motorcycle that the large reflective areas, the large areas that would be covered in paint, are basically creating these large black chunks, but they also have these huge white spaces on them. So functionally, this is kind of a white layer. The reason I'm doing that is she's wearing a leather outfit that will have huge amounts of flat blacks. But her skin tone, I want to have all the modeling, or just about all the modeling in that skin tone be done in the painting section, but still be a standalone ink image, so that for the most part, her skin won't have any rendering on it, leaving it as large white sections. The amount of detail that'll be in her dreadfalls will be so tight, it'll actually go a little bit past beyond being gray and being closer to black. But that will serve to frame her face. And in her face, the only details will be picking out the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and jewelry, things like that. But the large areas of the face will actually be left white. That'd be the same on her arms and on her legs. So all of those end up functioning as frames. All the black in those elements end up functioning as frames for the white areas. So she's not dominated by black shadows. The black shadows are framing the white space on her. So it comes off as a bit more like a white layer. About the only thing I have left to do in the background is you do see there are these large white areas for signage. And this is actually a thing I'm wanting to do. I've done a few of the illustrations so far, and I'm going to be doing in this story that I'm working on, where I do want to leave a lot of large white areas so I can then drop other artwork, whether it be advertisements or other illustrations I've done using them essentially as advertisements for products in a very cyberpunk kind of a way. And I went with that idea here. Except for here, I also know that I will go back and actually put in, I will draw in designs and advertisements on those large rectangular or the large signs in the background. So that won't be left as being white. That'll fall into the whole background gray and black sections. But yeah, functionally, there's so much focus on the main character that it functionally becomes a 2-layer illustration. The main character and the motorcycle in the foreground, and then all the buildings into the interior of this arcology as the secondary layer. Doing a lot of work with outlining the various elements of her of her outfit, including these great big stompy goth boots. Those are actually boots worn by the model that I was working with here. She also had the Dreadfalls in, which is why I wanted to work with this whole Cybergoth theme for this particular illustration. It's a very stylized motorcycle, not really built around any actual design. There are elements in it that, if you were to turn it a little bit, it would show that it's not actually an internal combustion engine. The wheels are suspended on these magnetic clamps. I've done some designs with that in other illustrations over the last 10 or so years. I like going back to that kind of idea. But yeah, now I'm working on putting in the detail in the face, and you'll notice there won't be a lot of detail on the face. It'll make it, which will actually make it stand out a lot from the background. My backgrounds tend to be really heavily detailed. But here I wanted to keep the actual detail on the skin tones as simple as possible. Even if this was just to be left as an ink illustration, it would still pop. It would still separate very well from the surroundings. And there are enough shadows in the setting that delineate the various light sources and such in the environment that it would be very clear that she's lit the same way. But I'm just wanting to, because the intent here is to do it in color. I have a very particular idea about how I want to color all the skin tones. So it's just working better for me in this case to leave the skin pretty wide open. Very similar to what I did with the one of the recent illustration discussion videos, the swordswoman and the church piece, where her armor was very detailed. But wherever the swordswoman herself was exposed, yeah, there's very little detail on that. And now getting into detailing all those Dreadfalls. I do like working with them. It's a fun design. It can take quite a while to get through, especially because I was taking the concept of the Dreadfalls and making it more complicated. Actually have them plugged into, like I said, the communications tower behind her and the computer in front of her. And definitely working with that whole 80s retro future thing with that computer display. It looks like a slightly rebuilt Commodore 64 or whatever sitting in front of her with CRTs, but all plugged into neural interface units. There's a traditional landline telephone in front of her as part of that complex. But that works. That tends to be part of that cyberpunk aesthetic. For the most part, the aesthetic of cyberpunk is, what if the 80s only more so? So, which goes really well with the big rewatch of Miami Vice I'm doing right now. Now we're getting into just using a brush to fill in the large black sections. I outlined most of the large areas of black on the figure. I had done a similar thing with the motorcycle. Usually I'll do that and then just fill them in with the brush. Sometimes I will do some freehand illustration with the brush. Much more difficult to control, so I don't do a lot of that. In this case, especially where I'm wanting to be this stark contrast between black and white, I'll be much more likely to want to outline the large areas of black. And the final step of the inking here is adding a bit of white around the main character, just to pull her out of the background a little bit more, just to make sure she separates a bit more. Adding in a few more highlights onto the metal. Absolutely love working on metal for the reflective capabilities or the reflective quality, and for things like this. Now you'll notice this ground is not wet like it's been in the last few illustrations I've done. I wasn't going to worry about reflecting things into the ground this time. And here we have the finished inked piece. So this 11-inch by 17-inch ink illustration is then scanned. I do my scanning at 1200 dpi, and then load it up into Photoshop. And there I will reduce it to 600 dpi for painting. I've talked about this a few times. For print, you want it to be at least 300 dpi. But if you raise the resolution, if you work with a higher resolution, it means that later on, if I wanted to print this at a larger size, like right now, 11 by 17 is a fairly large piece, but if I wanted to reprint it as a large poster, as long as you're doing your math fine, I could actually blow this up a very, very large size before you would start seeing the image degrade, before it became functionally lower than 300 dpi. What I'm also doing here is, once the image has been scanned, I'm actually taking bits of the line art and putting them on various different layers. So the deep background is on one particular layer, the middle background is on another layer on top of that, and then the foreground is on another layer on top of that. That is so that when I'm painting, when I paint the deep background, that painting layer is behind everything. The painting layer for the middle ground is only behind the middle ground line art, and the painting layer for the foreground is only behind the foreground line art. This means that I can do Ridley Scott or Tony Scott style lighting effects very easily. If I want to cover, if I want to put in a huge fog effect over the deep background, well, I've got my deep background coloring layer and then my deep background line art layer. I can add an additional layer above that to create fog and lighting effects over top of that, and then go to the middle ground coloring layer, and then followed by the middle ground line art layer. None of that will be affected. None of the middle ground will be affected by the lighting I put onto the deep background. And then I can do the same thing. I can put another layer of special effects, of glows or fog or whatever I want to do over the middle layer, and that will affect the middle layer and the deep background, but it won't touch the foreground. I just like setting that up in advance. So once those various layers have been set up, now I'm putting in these flat colors to make it easier to paint later. And the only thing that you really need to keep in mind with the way that I put down these flat colors is that the color I'm putting on here right now will have usually no relation to the actual color that everything will be. For instance, right now I'm starting to paint the deep, deep background. And working with this palette, this selection of colors in the middle of the page right now, in the middle of the screen right now, I put in this deep blue background. But originally, when I put a color there, it was this very pale blue. It's just so that it represents that it's on a different layer than everything else. It's just telling me if it's pale blue, it's on the very deep background. If it's these slightly darker blues, it's in the middle ground. And then it moves forward. I'll use other random colors. But generally, those colors won't have any relation to what the colors are that I'm actually painting with. So honestly, everything could be shades of green. It wouldn't make any difference to how I paint it. In fact, I've done that where I put in the most obnoxious, annoying colors as flat colors, because then when I go to actually do the painting and I'll use wherever I have like a light yellow, I can select all the light yellow at the same time, put it on its own layer, start painting on that. And if there's anything around that light yellow that has not been painted yet, it will be really obvious. Because say in that light yellow area, I painted everything shades of blue. Well, I'm probably using other shades of yellow to delineate the various other sections of color that I want to paint. And so I'll have all these blue and red, heavily detailed painting sections with this chunk of yellow in the middle of them that doesn't match anything. That's just telling me I haven't painted that yet. So I just have to go back and complete it. And it's like I was saying about the inking, same thing here. I'm painting from the background forward. So I make paint from back to front. With all of these sci-fi pieces I've been doing, I'm keeping the basic palette fairly simple. I'm mostly dealing with blues and reds, and in the vast majority of them, I'm keeping the deep backgrounds skewing blue, and then the foregrounds skewing red. And in fact, the backgrounds are generally blue, and basically they're cool colors and less saturated. The foregrounds are warm colors, such as reds, and more saturated. More of the color will be there. That helps also separate things in space. It's tricks like that can really make your illustrations seem more like a real place. It doesn't necessarily have to look like the real world. It just has to look like a world, an actual place that exists, that the characters you're working with are inhabiting. So I'm having a lot of, as it's moving forward in space, I'm adding in more and more red. It's actually, so essentially the background is, the illustration is composed of blue in the background, moving to red in the foreground. So there's this purple layer in the middle ground. As those blues are being affected by purples, by magentas, by the reds in the foreground. And you can see right here, there's these huge sections of yellow that's not going to be left being yellow. But it's telling me I haven't painted that section yet. So, but yeah, we've got bits of red light as we're getting closer and closer into the foreground. These are very pale light sources. They're not going to cast a whole lot of light, but there will be stronger light sources. Won't always see the light sources. In fact, in this one, probably the main red light sources are all completely off panel. They're off to the left or the right of the figure. Whereas in the background, you can see a lot of the blues are coming from a lot of those signs. They themselves, or some of the windows, they themselves are acting as light sources. But yeah, here I got a reddish purple light source casting onto the front of that particular storefront. Although the blue sign above it is really popping. And now you can see where I'm putting in some special effects over the very far layer, the very deep background, and then over the middle ground, just to push everything back a little bit further. It makes the main character pop out a little bit more, draws focus towards the main character and what she's doing a bit more. It's not overwhelming. You can still see all the line art. I'm not covering up any of the line art. In fact, those special effects layers are all being put in. The special effects layer itself is being set to screen. I'm not going to go entirely into what the various types of layers are, the types of painting layers, but basically screen makes very vibrant, glowing colors. You're more stripping. If I'm painting a red light into using on a screen layer, it's actually stripping everything behind it that isn't red, just leaving any of the red color back there. So it could make very pure, very vibrant color choices, so things don't get too muddy. It can be a little bit overwhelming depending on the type of image you're doing, so you need to strike a balance. But when you start playing around with that a bit more, you can get some really, really nice effects. So now I'm working on the motorcycle itself and creating this cast red light from the right side of frame. And clearly there is a blue light coming from the left side of frame. You can really see this on this curved windscreen. Again, I love working with reflective materials, chiefly metals, but a lot of glass effects. I was talking about a lot about glass effects in my recent Cyborg on a Rainy Street, or Robot on a Rainy Street illustration. discussion video. And really the only time I'm using these kind of effects here are pretty much just on this glass canopy, this windscreen, where it almost looks like an abstract design in the line art. But now that I'm putting in these colors and I'm putting in these bright light sources, it's very obvious that we actually have a bright red or very warm light source coming from the right side of frame, and a blue, very cool light source coming from the left side of frame, because the particular reflective qualities of that glass are picking it up even more. But now I want to paint a little bit of the red light falling onto the actual controls underneath that glass surface to make it even more obvious that not only am I drawing the surface of the glass, but I'm also wanting to draw things behind it being distorted by that glass. And now working on to the painted surface of the whole piece. Honestly, those lights in the foreground look a little bit, can look a little bit blue or a little bit green because of so much light around there, but then you end up painting them different colors. Again, those are just to make sure that I don't forget to paint them later. Now working on the dress of the character, dealing with that cast red light coming from the right side of frame and a bluish cast light from the left side of frame. For the most part, the last element that I work on are the skin tones, which I'm getting to at the moment. And I want to leave that for last because here's where all the work I did setting up the various light sources in the environment pays off. Now I'm going to be dealing first with the cooler light sources coming from the left side of frame and seeing how that distorts the color of her skin tones. And using, actually I had my gradient tool set to screen as I was brushing into that. Most of the painting I've been doing so far has been painted using this select gradient technique, where you use the lasso tool to select an area and then use the gradient tool or a brush to paint into it, so it doesn't pick anything outside of that. Most of what I'm doing on the main character, though, will actually be using an airbrush tool. I want to make the selections very, very soft, but I am starting using the gradient tool as well. And the selection tool, I'm keeping it as much as possible to only where it would be used underneath pre-existing line art. There will be a couple of exceptions. The red light that's falling on her leg will actually be blocked by the dress she's wearing, in which case I'll actually be creating a shape on her leg with the gradient tool. But for everything else, the shapes that are created on her skin will be done freehand with an airbrush like I'm doing right now. So a very soft edge brush. And the colors for this, I had chosen a very dark flesh tone to start with, and then I brush in cool tones on one side, and then out of that pick the tones I'll actually be painting with, and then eventually go brighter and brighter. I almost always work from dark to light. When I start painting a section, I put in the darkest color possible, and then I start painting light into that. The danger of doing that is you can end up making it too dark. It won't necessarily look too dark on screen, but when you go to print it, you'll find out everything has gotten very muddy. So you have to be aware of basically the math. Keep an eye on your sliders, on your color picker and your sliders to see what the actual mathematical value of the color is that you're using, that there isn't too much black ink in there. But also, frankly, if you do a lot of digital artwork, it would be a really good idea to print a bunch of it. So, and then take a look at it in print versus what it looks like on screen. And we'll give you a better idea of what these colors actually look like. I know monitors are extremely color accurate these days, especially really high-end ones. I still tend to not trust monitors because no two monitors display the same way. And when I was first learning computer coloring, when I was first learning digital coloring back in the late 90s, we were taught not to trust monitors. You have to look at the math. You have to figure out what these colors look like based on the various color values that they mathematically have. Theoretically, if you got good enough at it, you could paint on a black and white. You could paint full color on a black and white screen, and you would just know what the colors are going to end up printing as. I don't work that well, but I'm pretty good at knowing what this is actually going to print like by looking at the color values. So anyway, now we're getting brighter and brighter on the main character. The whole idea here was, again, starting with the darkest color I could think of that I could use for her particular skin tone. And then for the cool colors, basically building up the light that's being cast on her. I didn't want to. You don't want to start with the brightest color, and you certainly don't want to put in the darkest background color and then start painting your highlights, because then the piece just will not work unless you're going for this crazy blown out look to the piece. But with this character, I wanted to build it up. I wanted the blue color, the blue light coming from the left side of frame, to be not too dim of a color, but by putting in a lot of different versions, a lot of putting in a lot of variations of the cool color. It gives me the chance to really create what the character looks like in three-dimensional space, entirely by using just a paintbrush. So now that I got the basics done on the cool side, I'm now switching over to the warm side, to the warm light coming from the right-hand side of frame. And same procedure here. I took a very saturated red color, using it on screen, painting over her to see what the colors that I want are. And then I'll start selecting them, and then just building up that color. So I'm not going too bright just yet. These are still what I refer to as midtones. But I'll put down almost all of my midtones and then start painting in brighter highlights later on. You want to make sure that you don't put in bright highlights too early. You can get a nice effect with that. Doing that will make things look rather glossy, but it won't necessarily look like human skin. And so it depends on the texture. It depends that you're working on. It depends on what the particular element is made of that you're painting. So people are pretty reflective, but not nearly so much as, a chrome or something. This is where I was talking about using the lasso tool to basically create the shape of the shadow being cast on her leg. Like the light coming from the right-hand side of frame is being blocked by her dress, by the skirt. So I was using the lasso tool to create that shadow pattern, basically where light is being prevented from hitting her. And then using the soft airbrush tool to paint the light into that. Yep, same techniques being used here on her face. The model I was working with on this, Marie, she was very happy with the final result of this. She was very happy with how I managed to make the skin really glow. That's something I really like doing. which is a thing that happens. People's skin is translucent. It isn't perfectly opaque. You can see through the top layer of skin. Light on the other side of an arm or whatever does actually come through a little bit. And so I like being able to create that effect in figures like this, which is why the cool colors are actually being dragged a little bit past where they might necessarily actually be into. So the cool colors on the left side of her face are actually being dragged into the right side of her face a little bit past where you would think they would go. And the same with the red colors. The red colors are going from the right side of her face a little bit further into the left than you would normally think they would go, because your skin is a little bit translucent. And there's so much water in your body that you will actually transmit color and light from one side of your body to the other. So that's what I was doing here. When I had the basic pattern of light and dark painted in, I then took a super saturated version of the red color, and using my gradient tool set to screen again, painted over most of the face to create that extra glowing effect. And still putting in a few more highlights, because we still have to have a few brighter spots. One spot is actually the upper lip. People will draw the upper lip as a black line, but quite often where that darker line meets the rest of the skin, it's actually being pushed out a little bit. And so quite often there actually will be a lighter line, a brighter line above the top of the lip. And this image, the face was prominent enough in the page that I could really capture that. I haven't actually been doing a lot of work with skin tones in these illustration discussion videos, because I've been doing so many robots. So it's kind of nice to do a piece where she has no cybernetics, aside from the way that her dreadfalls are interacting with neural implants. Yeah, there are no specific visible cybernetics on her. So this is almost entirely done as regular human skin. Now I'm just adding in an additional light source just to give a little bit more volume to the character everywhere. There's certainly enough light bouncing around the environment to justify that. But it's basically just picking up a tertiary light source on both sides of the figure. So on the predominantly cool side of the figure, throwing in this little rim of additional warm light. On the warm side of the figure, I'm putting this little rim of cooler light, depending. Just to, again, give a little bit more volume, better sense of 3 dimensions. And then a final few brushes of brighter lights to make sure the skin tones aren't, for what I'm wanting, too dark. That I know how they're gonna print. Everything should pop really well. The character's not too muddy. Yeah, she's popping out of the environment really well. There's a lot of contrast between her and everything else. But overall, so with her skin tone being left completely white in the original line art, it allowed me this much freedom to be able to do this color modeling and 3-dimensional modeling on her. And it's popping in a few additional special effects behind her to bring both her and the motorcycle into the foreground, and then adding a few touches of special effects onto the motorcycle itself, because it's all metal, plastic, and glass, so it will have certain reflective qualities. And I think, we're just dropping in some extra white highlights here and there. But yeah, the bulk of special effects I do is a mix of using different layers and using painting effects, rather than necessarily grabbing the line art and turning it into a different color, which is a technique used a lot in comics, but it's not one that I'm using here. So thank you very much for hanging out to watch this particular piece, and I hope to see you in the next discussion video.